here we are. Part of me wants to just stand here and take it in. Not a compelling reflection, though. Perhaps, maybe. I do feel in my own self a sense of arrival. We've arrived together somewhere, and I have been thinking a lot about how I arrived to you and how you arrived to me. First is that interim ministry, as you may have heard, is a ministry of change. So when we think about the next 2 years, if the job is done well, in 2 years, I will leave. And in 2 years, you will be calling and celebrating a settled minister. The nature of my time with you is such that it must end in 2 years. But when I think about interim ministry as a time of change, I think, wow, they've been through so much change already. Yeah. Are you tired? Yeah, you can say yes. Thanks, Jane. Jane's nodding. Are you tired? Part of me pictures actually a little moment I want to have with you, imagining that some of you are like, please, could we feel settled already? Could we feel clear already? Could we know what we're doing already? Does that feel true? Yeah. Some of you might be going, we have so much new things to do together. There's so much work to be done. There's so much change to be had. There's so many things we can create and do differently. I'm so ready for more change. Jane's nodding again. Jane, you hold all complexity. Yes, this is the moment that we have found ourselves in, a tired moment. For those of you who feel wary of more change or weary of the change you've already gone through, I want to say, I feel you. I feel you. The strange thing about interim ministry is such that it was a total leap of faith. As you heard from your transition team, you find out that your settled minister is leaving. A team is put in motion to interview available ministers. They do a video interview. It's like online dating. We sign a contract over the phone. Karin, I'm looking at you. I show up. I show up at your hospital bed. I show up in your pulpit. I show up in the midst of relationships and patterns and ways of being that you have been in for quite some time now, and yet here I am, I show up. It's a little ridiculous, and it's a total act of trust. So what I ache to say to you today is that I do not think that trust is expected. I expect your weariness and wariness. And I think we earn it in relationship with each other. Here we are. We have arrived in a moment of faith and trust. Given that arrival, it feels appropriate to tell you how I arrive. Because as I show up to you and I show up in the midst of that which you care about, when I show up saying, let's change something you've done for a long time, when I show up to you when it's only new and it doesn't feel like we know each other yet, and there I am in the most intimate moment that you've had in a while, it might be good for you to know me. What I would say about how I arrive is that you as a congregation and I are in a parallel process for two things. One, in my own life, I have recently been humbled by big, important projects that did not go as planned. From friendships to a marriage, to career changes, to expectations about the world. 2, developmentally, you and I are nearly the same age. You were born in the late 80s, and so was I. What I mean by that, do you remember your 30s? Do you remember your 30s? Collectively, do you feel 30 right now as a congregation? Do you remember what it was like in your 20s where you really thought you'd have it figured out by your 30s? And then you got to your 30s and you really thought by your 40s you'd have it figured out, right? It is developmentally appropriate at this time in our lives to say, wow, we are at the point we didn't think we would be at. We are somewhere else together. The gift in our parallel process is that it makes us trustworthy companions. It does. It makes us trustworthy because nothing we do or say to each other is rooted outside of our lived experience. We promise not to do or say something because it would be sweet or nice or because what we should be doing, but because I will look to you and say, this is what I know in my 30-something-year-old being. And you will look back at me and say, this is what I know in my being. And we will learn to trust each other from that place. That is a gift that we bring to one another. In the coming weeks, I'll say more about what interim ministry looks like, but instead for today, I want to say what it's like to find each other at this particular moment. The way I want to do this is through a story. Now, I come from Southern California, which is earthquake country. Southern California has 10,000 earthquakes a year, some of which are felt more than others. Now, this recent summer, 2 people who are dear to me and myself were watching my niece and my nephew. The gender-neutral word for that would be my nibblings. Okay? So I was watching and loving my nibblings, and they had just moved from Arizona to California. So they hadn't experienced an earthquake quite like that yet. And we're seated at a dinner table, about to have dinner, and the 3 adults at the table begin to realize that the chandelier is shaking. Now, my nibblings have never experienced an earthquake before. There's a moment between the 3 adults where we have to decide what to do. Now, one of us, I won't say who, pushes themselves back from the table as if to run out of the house, saying, we better get out. Another one pushes themselves closer to the table to say, let's just keep eating and act like it's not happening. A third of us looks to the others and starts to go underneath the table, because that's what you're supposed to do, right? Right, okay. So they start to go underneath the table. Meanwhile, my nibblings have a vague sense that the earth is shaking, that they are moving, and that we are not in control of it. Now, luckily, it was one that passed relatively quickly, and we began to answer the questions of these 2 young ones, mostly by Googling which of the 3 adults was right. As if to say, this is how you handle it when the earth, you know, moves beneath your feet. When what you know is about to change. Now, these 3 responses are wonderfully symbolic. How do we respond when the earth begins to move beneath our feet? Now, my previous ministry that I come to you from is the ministry of restorative justice. I served in prisons and nonprofits in California, working on restorative justice circles to engage issues of violent and sexual and complex harm. And what I know from that ministry and that I bring to you is this: any reaction we have to change is a sign of how we've learned to survive it in the past. Any reaction that we bring to the present is actually telling the person in front of us what helped get us through the last time we had to deal with something like this. Now, churches are revelation factories, not just because of what we learn in relationship, but how we reveal ourselves in relationship. In churches, we show up heart longing and heart broken, and we show both to each other. Now, we show it to each other through our personal experience of harm and trauma. When I interact with you in an email or in a pew or in the service or on a committee meeting, you are showing me every way you've been harmed and every way you've been loved, all at once. The task is not to confuse how you're responding to me with the truth. The task is to say you are responding to me and it is showing me the life you've lived, and I have reverence for the life you've lived, and I will be curious about the life you lived, and we will figure it out together. Now, in that space, the first two responses at the kitchen table of my family, one of which was run, the other of which is act like it's not happening, are both ways of showing us how we've learned to respond to what's difficult. Both of which are healthy responses. I have empathy and care for the part of me that meets challenge and says, I don't know if I feel safe here. I feel empathy for the part of me that meets challenge and says, maybe I'll feel safe if I control the situation and act like it's not happening. I imagine that those two responses and more are present in this room as you've navigated your transition. Those of you for whom the safest option felt like to push away, those of you for whom the safest option felt like, let me see if I can make it better, sometimes by being controlling, sometimes by being enforcing. These are perfectly normal responses to a world that's in change, and they're worthy of our empathy. The spiritual practice is in the third option, the one person who began to move to go down beneath the table. Symbolically, that move to go down closer to what is changing, to really feel what is changing, is the spiritual practice we have together now. When it starts to shake and our fight or our flight kicks in, which is normal and healthy, because thank God you are still alive. But when things begin to change, can we practice moving closer to what is changing together? Can we get on the threshold of our misery, mystery, and revelation without fixing it, acting like it's not happening, or running away from it? Now, I am reminded of one time in California during the divorce of my mother and father. My father and I were keeping our relationship barely alive, and he had a brilliant idea to do that. Let's go on a camping trip up the Sierra Nevada mountain range where we visit all of the weird things we never visit when we're headed to Yosemite National Park. It's worthy of laughing at. It was a very dad move. We're gonna visit all the weird things. So he piled into his car, and one of the weird things he wanted to show me was a fault line. So there go my dad and I. We walk to this fault line in a parking lot where there are no other people, because it's one of the weird things. And as we get to the fault line, we're looking at a crack in the earth that we cannot see the bottom of. Now, I remember looking to my dad, and I remember saying, "Dad, how deep is it?" "Well, Sam, it's really deep." "Thank you, Dad." And as he walked away, I remember getting down on my body, on my belly, and I remember ever so carefully peering over the edge in wonder. Belly to ground. This is an image for us in interim ministry. We will be a people belly to the ground to pay attention to what is changing, what we do not know, and what we cannot predict together. Trusting that if we can stay at the threshold of revelation, something will emerge that we could not have forced if we had tried too quickly or gone away. I promise to you that I will be a loving and a curious minister, and that I will be with you belly to the ground. Will you join me? May it be so. Amen.